The recording. I think the presentation, it's right here. Yeah. So welcome everyone. I am Priyanjali, a service designer within HMRC and part of the working group for the policy design community, which is co-hosting the session with London Strategy Network. We are basically a community of cross-government people that work within policy design. So for our today's session, we have Ben Holliday with us, who is going to be talking about his book Multiplied and how can digital transformations deliver more impact for the public sector. A little bit about you, Ben. Like I said, he's the author of this book Multiplied, and he's the chief designer at TPXimpact. He has over 20 years of experience in design and digital transformation, and he works with organizations towards change programs and with teams to deliver modern digital products and services. Ben has previously worked with the civil services as the head of user centered design at DWP, Department of Work and Pensions. In his role, uh, in his role, he led work in digital programs as well as initiatives to bring together digital and policy teams, including work in collaboration with Policy Lab in the Cabinet Office. Today's session is going to be very interactive, and we'll also be going into breakout rooms to have discussions. And he'll introduce his book, a little bit of his talk, and then we'll be moving on to it. Without any further ado, I hand over to you, Ben, and your team.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for such a lovely introduction as well. Hopefully you can all hear me and see my screen as well, if people give me a thumbs up. So fantastic to be here and spend lunchtime with you today. So we've got some of the TPX design team with us here today. So I'm going to be introducing the book, like you've just heard. So and then I've got Mega, Vicky, Martin, and Joe with us today from the team. So Vicky's going to be taking us through a bit of a case study to put some of the ideas, bring some of that to life in terms of work we've been doing at TPX. Mega and Martin are then going to take us through some practical kind of discussion with you in breakout groups as well. So a bit from me to start with. So to introduce the book, so I've got a copy here. So this is Multiplied. It was first launched in March 2021, which feels like a while ago now. And it's been a pleasure actually taking it out and speaking about these ideas and introducing some of the ideas in the book to different government teams, whether it's design teams or policy teams over the last year and a bit longer than that now as well. And there's a link here, and we can share links as we go in the chat as well, which is where you can find out about how to get hold of the book. So if you do want to read more or explore more after today, you can get the book in most of the usual kind of places you would go. So it's really great actually to be asked to speak at this event, because at TPXimpact as chief designer, I lead our design team. So that means I'm responsible for practices including service design, our research practices, content design, interaction, and product design. And this has been a really great chance to think about actually how our work is increasingly supporting and working in policy design spaces, and also how I think a lot of what's in the book can apply in policy spaces as well. So to introduce the themes here, Multiplied really it's really the belief that more impact through organisations, through our organisations or the organisations you work with, the services we deliver is possible, and that's because of how we can potentially use digital transformation. And I really like this quote, so I always tend to use this up front. But this is by Arne Nass, who was he's no longer with us, a late Norwegian philosopher, and he was a famous environmentalist as well. He had this great quote that claiming that something is impossible is nothing more than a temporary working hypothesis, which I love as a designer. And this idea that 2 + 2 can equal 5 if something changes. And the idea really, and the thing I'll explore briefly now, is that it's this idea that change is something that becomes possible, or it's made possible. And a lot of the time for our work, it's how we respond to the challenges, the immediate challenges, or the goals, or the things that we're asked to actually respond to or need to respond to as government. And interestingly, like I said, the book launched in 2022, but actually I was writing it mostly in 2021. So it ended up with quite a lot of perspective through the pandemic and COVID. And really, I think often really what gets called design thinking, and I'll explore that a bit more. The important question in that is always really what can change, what change is possible, what can we make possible, what could it be like, what could be made possible, as well as recognizing how things can change and how fast things change. So COVID is an example of the pandemic. I mean, this photo is interesting because if I'd shown you this in 2015, it really wouldn't have made sense. And actually, we talk sometimes about kind of needing mission aligned government and aligned goals, but actually the pandemic, and I talk about this a lot in the book, we really did see government and different parts of government come together, different types of organizations, voluntary community sector, local government, central government policy, all having to align really rapidly and actually really successfully in a number of examples as well. So a little bit of framing as well, which I think is useful. So the book is about digital transformation, and not everything we do is digital as such, and it's always important to think about that. And when I talk about services, actually, like services, actually digital is an opportunity. We talk about the role of technology in delivering services, but services are really about outcomes. They're about what happens. They're about things that happen offline and online. And so in terms of the kind of definition of digital, this is probably the simplest kind of lens I can put on it in terms of thinking about this usefully. And for me, really, it's about how we lead and respond in a digital world. And digital becomes a combination of how we think about and respond to change, and also how technology plays a role in that. And that's very much about technology being part of all of our lives and the day-to-day of our lives in terms of shaping how we interact, how we live our lives, and also how we respond to what's happening in our day-to-day lives. And so change for me as well is really about how our organizations work. It's how they organize to deliver the best possible outcomes from the work that we're involved with. And I talk a lot about in the book actually this idea of more impact and more value, but really it's about how we unlock that. How does that become possible through the types of change that we're involved with? And I think that to an extent it's a mindset shift, but it's also the momentum we build through different approaches to do things differently. So as a kind of the main introduction of the book is it talks about multipliers, this idea that in transformation, actually there are lots of kind of component parts, lots of methods, lots of approaches that actually come together and enable us to achieve things, to deliver our goals, to deliver outcomes. And you can see that technology is one part of this list. But actually, when we think about digital transformation and how that works in places like government, it's about how we work in terms of work with people. It's about how we organize through teams. It's about the potential of participation in our work. It's about how we think about inclusion. It's about how we use research as a way into inclusion, as a way of actually increasing the diversity and reach of our work. It's about how knowledge becomes a multiplier. And then actually in government, you're probably familiar with the idea of DDAT, and I quite often reframe that as not digital data and technology, but design data and technology. But these kind of core disciplines, these skill sets working together through how we deliver. So things like agile approaches. And this is really just a very quick pause, but if you are interested in reading the book, these are the main themes. So we do, and I should say as well, lots of collaborators helped kind of frame this book, and it was great to kind of take a snapshot of kind of how digital government was thinking and looking forward, kind of coming from the pandemic, going back a year and a half ago now. So I think partly there's an opportunity, and this is still the question, to explore what the future of digital transformation really means. Like, what does it mean for service delivery in government? What does it mean for policy spaces as well? Lessons from the pandemic. So I talked about that, and also understanding that actually that type of urgent response, what can we learn from that in terms of what was achieved and how fast and how effectively? And some of that is about making more possible. And there's a big theme in the book as well that I won't talk about today that was really about the local connection into our work. And that's something that has really kind of struck me through involvement in policy work over the years in government. And I've worked in and around government for 10 years now. And really the ability to make that link back to people and places and communities that are affected by policy. So not just policy coming from the places kind of within central government, but also the link back to real experience. How do you design for what happens, and how do you really shape outcomes and create that connection? And then the need for a new mindset, which I mentioned, and also this idea that more is possible. So not just more impact, but I think more value as well, and that like people should expect more in terms of what we can deliver from the types of work we do and the approaches that we use. So just to set this up, I wanted to focus specifically, and I thought it was an opportunity to think about design just for the rest of my talk to introduce us today. So before I hand to Vicky, I'll focus here. And it's this idea really of like design as a multiplier. However you think about design approaches, they can be a multiplier in terms of how we apply those to our work. This is our design team. This is when we were together last month at TPX, and we try and bring our team together 3 or 4 times a year at least in this kind of hybrid world that we now work in. And we're all across the UK, so it is challenging, but it's definitely worthwhile. And I wanted to make the point as well. It kind of reminds me of this picture that communities of practice are important. So this idea that knowledge is a multiplier, also how we share stories, experiences, how we bring people together. We used to say right people, same room a lot when we were when I worked for the government digital service and then DWP, but also thinking about the virtual kind of extension of that now as well. I think this is a useful slide, and there's a link here to the blog post. And again, I think if one of our team could post this in the chat, that would be great. But we thought a lot of TPX, and this is really an extension of some of the work in the Multiplied book, of what does it mean for design to add value. And I talk about it a lot as a design philosophy. And really, we've used a set of principles to make sure that we're really clear as a team in how we develop our practice in terms of how we talk. I mean, sometimes it is specifically about user-centered design and how that adds value in our work, but really how good design or the perception of good design can start to support teams and different types of professions in new ways. So as a simple model, like we start with people focused, and that means putting people at the center of all of our work. And that's really about who you center in the work. And I think design is very much about that people focus. And good design should create, and we've been really specific again with like, what do we mean by good design? Well, that should be about positive outcomes for citizens and the organizations we work with. And then I mentioned before diverse reach. So like having to really focus on and encourage diverse thinking through well-targeted use of things like user research as a specialist discipline, the way that we can use things like co-design. And this is really that good design should work for everyone, which is obviously a really important, and it's one of those core design principles in government that many of us have been working with for a number of years now. The third one, and I think again, this is kind of about understanding the value of design, is that it's really about actually visual and creative, in that we can create, we can be explorative with visual artifacts to support change. And good design should be creative, and I'll come back to this, but really it's also how we make our work engaging. And I think part of the role of how we work in new ways, whether it's as policy teams, design teams, and delivery, it's actually how we bring people into the work to participate, and actually how we do that creatively as part of making it engaging, making it possible. And then ideas made real, and again, like how we do things like prototyping, ideation, and good design being something people can directly interact with. And the final one, like we use this phrase quite a lot in government in different places, but bold and ambitious, like how we challenge ourselves and others to be bold and ambitious. So, and I've said this already, but good design being about what could be possible rather than what isn't. So just to probably dig into those a little bit just before I hand over. So really, again, multiplied is really the impact of our work having the potential to be far greater. And again, I think that's with the way that we use design as a multiplier. So visual creative approaches and things like learning by doing. And then finally, just as well, I wanted to say that I think this is possibly the kind of superpower of design, that it's the making something that's tangible. And really this idea that actually anything that can be imagined, actually we can start to make real now through the types of approaches and methods that we have access to and the way that we implement that. And I kind of think about this as if we can start to see what's possible then in the future. We have the approaches through design, we have the mindsets, we have the way of thinking and the way of articulating and making things real now. And to give you an example, I could have shown you at this point screenshots of like digital designs of some nice apps or service blueprints even. But I think this is what it's about when it's about design making things real, and that prototyping doesn't have to just be websites or apps. It's how we take future models of how things could work and we make them real. We let them play out now in the way that we can learn from them. We let people directly experience that. This is a good example because it's actually a social work situation in London, and we're testing some technology using an iPad here where we've And really, it's about the way that social workers are interacting with families. Like you can see the child here whose face is hidden. But really, we're trying to understand actually how technology works in a very human system here. And technology has a role in that in terms of how we transform this system. But this is prototyping. This is making it real. This is bringing a future into the now. So this is another example I like as well. It's a little bit more left field, but I use Rob Hopkins' book, if you know Rob Hopkins' work, a really great book called What Is to What If. So he's quoted in Multiplied. This example is Extinction Rebellion taking over and transforming the public space this is Waterloo Bridge, which is quite near the TPX office in London. I think it's 2021. But what I quite like about this, and this comes from Rob Hopkins' idea, is that each demonstration or action always includes some kind of manifestation of the future that they want to see. So in this case, Waterloo Bridge was turned into a garden city for the day. So not only did they shut it down, they brought trees and plants on and set up a skate park and a cafe. And actually, I think that's also how design works. It becomes meaningful and it becomes real. So once you've experienced this, and I remember at the time, a few of our team walked across this and said how great it was at the time. Once you've kind of experienced it, it's much easier to imagine it as a reality. That change starts to become possible. And then the final quote I wanted to share, that this is another really nice one that I like from the book, and it's by Dr. Pippa Grange and a book called Fear Less. And really it's the idea and the importance of storytelling. So this idea that we build our identity, and I think this is in our work as well, and our beliefs about what's possible on the stories we take as true. And I love this idea that we can control our stories, we can reshape them even when we can't control the circumstances. And for me, like, I love this quote because I think everything really and what makes change possible is about how we respond to constraints, how we respond to the boundaries that we work with it. And policy is very much about that. And there's all sorts of other constraints when we're working in government. But it's how we start to shape and own these stories in new ways, bring other people's stories into the work as well. And really, I think every type of service we might work on has a relationship with a policy story, with a real community story as well. And that's important. So practical tool time. I wanted to leave you with something practical, and we'll share these slides as well. And it'd be great, and we're going to discuss some of this shortly. But I think we can get to quite a simple model to start a conversation about how design can be applied to areas like policy teams and how it can start to add value and be useful. So taking some of that philosophy I introduced before, I'm being really careful here not to mix things up with what might just be labeled agile delivery or agile methods, but really starting to think about if there was a place to start or you needed to start somewhere, like what would that look like? So I think there's 4 areas, and we'll explore these more, and Vicky will bring these to life a bit in a minute through some of our work elsewhere. But number 1 is like design methods in terms of being able to understand different types of user needs. So again, like using ethnographic research methods to understand the needs of service users. One of the things I see again and again and again is that this perception of users being end users only, so the people that actually use a service somewhere, but also like how do we design better modern government, like the needs of other civil servants, the staff in our organizations, the people running services, the professionals in our services, whether we're doing health policy or something equivalent. And actually the ability to think about framing needs through things like life events, individual context scenarios, and that use of continuous user focus in our work. So that's the first kind of area, I think, where we start to really see the value of design approaches. Number 2, like problem framing. And I should say as well, I don't think problem framing is a new thing, because sometimes we can sort of say, well, design is about problem framing. I know that problem framing is key to policy work. But actually, bringing perspective again through user focus in terms of how we ask the right questions to frame the problem. And this is something I've spent a lot of time on through kind of design work in government over the years. And again, I think also with the right constraints, framing is about constraints, and constraints can support increased creativity and diverse thinking. So like I talked about before. And that's also, I think, about ensuring, and I've explored this in the book, that teams have shared understanding of the problem spaces, the goals that we're working towards. And quite often that's not the case. We find that actually teams aren't on the same page. They're not aligned in the right way to really solve the problem and deliver the right outcome. So that's number 2. Number 3, so this idea of visualization, and I think visualization I talked about before, but how that enables us to see, to understand the system, to understand the component parts, the relationships of something. And in kind of service design terms, that could be how we visualize, kind of, we talk about as is maps, like as is journeys. But also, I think in kind of plain language, it's how we explore how things could work in the future. How could we reconfigure things? Like, a lot of design is reconfiguration, understanding the component parts, working from first principles in terms of what could be possible. And again, I think that you could use all types of visual artifacts, and this isn't really about saying like it's about one particular kind of journey map tool, but really it's like, how do you start to visualize in a way that you focus teams and groups on what could be possible? And then the final one, so again, making it real. So like the examples I just showed you, so rapid ideation, prototyping, and testing. So using design approaches to actually, like, first of all, rapidly explore ideas. So quite often some design approaches can actually be an unblocker. They help us to look at alternatives, make more intuitive leaps in a way that we can then go and test those, take an evidence-based approach to actually learning more about those ideas. But it is the ability to make real things, whether it is actually like real digital tangible products people can interact with, or the type of role play I showed you before, where we're actually changing a whole situation in terms of how frontline support might work, how part of a system might work in the future. So we'll come back to those, but I guess the important thing I wanted to finish with is just to say that user-centered approaches are really just, for me, they're another way to gather evidence, evaluate options, and build certainty. And this builds beautifully into the work that Vicky's going to talk you through. And in any kind of policy intervention, I don't think there are a separate set of processes to be followed. And I've been very deliberate as well, and with some work we're doing in government departments at the moment, and I think it's important we talk about user-centered approaches. Sometimes that design word or design framing can be unhelpful, when really what we're trying to do is center people in our work and bring a set of techniques in terms of how we are creative at looking at how things could work in the future. So I think that's plenty from me to start with. So I'm going to hand over to Vicky to take us through a case study. Are you there, Vicky?
Thanks, Ben. Fantastic. So nice to see you all and be here today. We just wanted to share a bit of a case study of some recent work we're doing in the Department of Health and Social Care. And I can see a couple of familiar faces on the call, so hi to anyone who has been involved in that work. And what we were looking at here is how we can support policymakers in the department to use some UCD skills and approaches. And as Ben has just mentioned there, the language and the framing of that has been a really important part of that challenge. And we've actually tried kind of quite a few variations about how we talk about user-centered approaches, design skills, and bring that in, that I'll come on to a little bit later. When we started this work with the team, so the setting at the moment is that there are very small numbers of people who have experience of kind of applying user-centered approaches in policy spaces. But that was normally happening only in very small pockets and quite late in the process. Typically, if you've got a digital team involved in a digital service, we bring in some more design skills there. But the request from the team within the department was to see how we could build much more awareness of these approaches at scale. So rather than that just happening one-on-one where people were working with design teams, we were able to kind of introduce more tools into the whole department and into the policy space to help people know what they could get from design techniques, and in particular encourage teams to start applying some of this themselves. They have a small team of design practitioners, and it was really about what could be introduced to everybody to start to build into some default policy processes. So next slide, please, Ben. We began, like any good design project, by doing a bit of research and trying to understand what the barriers were right now. So what was stopping people from doing this? Was it awareness? Was it access? And these were the key things that came up in our early conversations. So we actually had some great conversations about perceived tension in the ways of working. So there were lots of policy teams that thought that the way digital teams do stuff is quite different and perhaps not that compatible with what policy making looks like. Some of the things that were coming up there were things like the sort of natural part of iterating and building design processes where we expect to try things out, to be wrong the first time, to learn and change our minds and change course. And actually there was a real hesitancy in some of the policy teams we spoke to about accepting that kind of relationship to policy work. They were much more expecting that as the policy professionals, they were supposed to have the answers, they were supposed to know the solutions, and they were supposed to, be clear on that starting point. We had some classic things about time and the pressures to kind of deliver very quickly on certain briefs. And this perception that design was this very long fixed process that they didn't have a chance to build in. And certainly as well that policy areas are often quite constrained. So depending on how that came in to the team and what the brief was, they didn't feel like there was a lot of room for maneuver to try out loads of different ideas. And so we don't need to do all that design stuff because we know what we're going to implement already. And loud and clear within DHSE in particular, this kind of lack of access to specialist skills, to people who know how to do this stuff, and a wariness of kind of jumping in themselves. So those were a few of the things that we were hearing surface from the teams. Very curious to know if any of those kind of feel relatable and appropriate in your situation too. But so what we set out to do, and if we could jump onto the next slide, please, Ben, was to really create some tools and resources for this community that really showed the flexibility of design approaches. So what we were keen to do here is really, rather than kind of going in and trying to talk to those teams about an idealistic or theoretical approach to design that felt miles away from where they were, it was about meeting them. Where are you right now, and what could be some first steps? How could we introduce some of this? And how can we really get it across that design is a mindset and a way of thinking about some of these challenges, and help them have some tools and techniques to be able to do that, rather than feeling that it's a thing that belongs to a whole different set of people and it is a different type of project altogether. And that's really where this work tried to show a range of everything that could happen, from if you are able to bring in experts who can help you in this, through to what you might be able to do. And actually, one of the kind of key refrains we came back to was this framing of trying to, in all of the different moments and approaches we talk through, describe to people that there is always an option, whether that is there might be a 6-month option, but we can come up with some things that could happen in a few weeks, in even a day. If you just have a moment, it's never going to hurt, and could really help you sit down and think about the problem differently, write out some different user perspectives, seek somebody to explain to you something that is a missing piece of the puzzle right now. So yeah, we're building out all these different cases, and one of the core bits of the work has been trying to help people understand what design can bring to them. So these are a few of the sort of themes that have come through as we're highlighting the benefits and really trying to make it all quite real in a policy environment. So what does engaging in more of a user-centered process bring to that space? And actually, we had lots of stories loud and clear from DHSE that these are some of the ways. So reducing risk is really all about helping you understand if you're on the right lines really early. So what we mean here is that actually the risk of you implementing something eventually that doesn't have the intended outcomes, that doesn't meet those needs, can be really helped by this kind of iterative process of getting things in front of people early, of course correcting, of adapting the ideas when you see it tested out in some real environments. And beyond just reducing the risk, it can also actually introduce loads of new opportunities as well. So by getting out in front of the real people who are impacted by these policy changes, you'll understand much, much more about the wider landscape that these exist within, and potential other opportunities. And you're going to learn really quickly. So the ultimate hope here is all of these things are leading towards building the confidence of the team in this particular intervention, to be able to stand up and say, we've explored a whole load of ideas, we've learned from what we did there, we have tested them out with people, and we have a lot of confidence in suggesting this particular approach to the problem that we've been given. Next slide, please. And like specifically in DHSE, so just to give you a flavour of some of the things that we've been producing with the team, some of the things looked a little bit like this. So we are trying to use the formats that exist and resonate with the policy community right now. In this case, on the left there is a training course we've been running as part of their policy certificate. So that's their internal upskilling programme for policy professionals. They tend to be short training sessions that can be on all sorts of things, from devolution to here where we're trying to bring in user-centered methods. So we've been using some of those existing formats, and that's all in line with this attempt to kind of work with that community, to work with the languages, the examples and the approaches that are going to resonate with what really are the needs of that team. It doesn't help if we are presenting this as a brand new shiny thing that is totally different and separate to the ways they're approaching things before. It's also really patronizing to assume that we are the only people who are thinking about framing problems or thinking about who the users are. That's absolutely not the approach here. What we're trying to do is say, hey, here are some tools, here are some resources, here are some ways that might help you do that, from communities over here in digital design teams where we have learned about some of these things in practice. And the design terminology point was a really interesting one. So we have had quite a lot of debate about where we draw the line on some of those things. And actually, we found in the early days, we tried to kind of strip out lots of the jargon altogether. But what that did mean was that people were left a little bit unclear about what they had been introduced to and how to find out more about it. So actually keeping in the framing of these user-centered approaches meant that we were introducing communities, disciplines, and areas. Like, we are talking to you about user research, you can go off and engage with user researchers, bring in those kind of experts if you need to. And just on this one, so obviously Ben has introduced these 4 areas, and I wanted to mention that in our work in particular, it's been these 2 that we have focused on a little bit more heavily, just as a starting point to kind of test the theories and the approaches behind them. This kind of policy challenge, the reframing and defining space, has been a really interesting one to give some attention. I think we found in particular there's a lot of work that goes on to frame a policy problem, but often that is from the perspective of the organisation, the systemic change, the overall outcomes as a society we want to see. And it was really helpful exercise to sit down with policy makers and talk about, if we were to explain that from the perspective of an individual person, if we were to explain it from the perspective of somebody who's delivering the service. So in our case, often in health, that might be a care worker or a patient or a doctor. You know, how is the expression of this problem affecting them right now? And likewise, I think there's a huge amount of impacts that can be had from the prototyping and testing area. So that making things real, and having some really open conversations about what non-digital prototyping techniques look like. We've called heavily on lots of the work of people like this group and Policy Lab in that. But I think it's really powerful when we can distill kind of big policy changes, but into some small interactions that can help us learn much, much more. So those are a few of the ones that were helpful to us and that we kind of gave some attention with DHSE, but really wanted to just kind of open it up to the group. And I guess that's what we're going to go into a bit of a discussion about now, is to think about which of these, you know, might be the most valuable or could be the easiest to get started with in your context. And I know we've got quite a few designers on the call as well. So I guess where you have found this particularly useful as well, what might be the thing that demonstrates the most impact and what could be possible right now?
Fantastic, thank you, Vicky. So I'll hand over to Mega and Martin if you're there.
Yeah. Thanks Ben, thanks Vicky. Hi, I'm Mega. I'm a design lead at TPXimpact. And now Martin and I will run a bit of a practical discussion. And what we're going to do is we're going to use some time and breakout groups to go deeper into applying design for policy. And this is the exercise we will do. We will have 10 minutes in the breakout rooms. Apologies, Ben, I did update the slide, but that hasn't updated here. So we will have 10 minutes in breakout groups to talk about these 2 questions. The first one is, how might these design methods apply or be useful to your current or future work? You can also think about what are some similar methods or approaches that you're already applying in your work. The second question is, how might are there any challenges or blockers to using these types of design methods and approaches? Have you encountered anything? Do you sort of like see what are some of the barriers that almost stop you from sort of applying some of these methods and approaches? Now, not every breakout group is going to have a facilitator, so do intro yourselves and kick off your discussions. When we get back, Martin is going to help us facilitate a chat. What we would really like for you to think about or come back with are 2 points each from each of the breakout groups, so that you can share that on the chat. And that would help us build a collective picture together that we can all see and talk about in terms of how we apply or want to apply design for policy and any challenges and blockers we face. Does anybody have any questions around that?
I don't have a question, but would you be able to just paste the questions in the chat so that if they disappear for people, or if the people haven't written them down yet, they can kind of copy paste them into kind of a document and have them as a reference? That would be great. Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah, they're coming in the chat now. Perfect. So if you can start the breakout groups, we can get it.
I'm just going to actually copy paste the questions just myself into a document. Okay, you will all be put into a breakout room.
See you all soon.
See you soon. See you in 10 minutes, right?
Yep, 10 minutes.
Oh.
Welcome back, everyone.
Yeah, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had some good discussions in there.
Did everybody else get that horrible moment where you were mid-sentence and suddenly you were looking at a whole different people? Yeah, thank you, everybody. If we could go to the next slide, Ben. So we've got 9 minutes left. I really want to respect people's time, but it would be great for people to share back. So I'm asking you in the nicest way possible. We've probably got time for 5 groups to share back. So if you want to volunteer in the chat now, and I'll call on you in order, and the first 5 people to volunteer, we will organise getting you a copy of Multiplied sent out. And if you already have a copy of Multiplied, please own up, and we'll go down the list like that. So if you're number 6, you might be, but answers in the chat. Who wants to go? Andrew Knight from Group 5 would love to volunteer. So if I could ask 2 points, Andrew, from your group within about 60 seconds, that would be absolutely brilliant. And I'll try not to be like really aggressive with the times if it's really interesting. So yeah, jump in when you're ready.
Hi everyone. We thought there was a few problems. One was we did agree that we thought all the methods were useful, but sometimes they were difficult to apply because the infrastructure is just not there to be able to make it happen. Like there's not the right people in place, so we don't have like user panels and stuff like that. There was also a bit of a feeling that the policy teams often had a solution, but they didn't have the problem in mind, and so there was a lot of kind of reframing that needs to happen, and that sometimes can be quite frustrating for design people who kind of become what you sometimes call disco hostages, where they're like trapped in disco, and this cycle of kind of discovery and research and reframing, and they never escape it, this sort of nebulous world, which for design people who are practical people, they want to make things, can be a little bit frustrating. That was us.
Amazing, thank you. Yeah, I've come across a lot of disco hostages of my time. I did not know that was the phrase though, and I'm totally stealing that. That's fantastic. Mia Peters, if you want to jump in, next volunteer. We still need 3 more. Ben's got books like covering his house. I'm sure he wants to be rid of some.
Hiya, we just talked about that, sort of tension where perhaps the service that has initially engaged you doesn't particularly want you to go out and ask questions of people because they assume that they know what the solution is and they know the opinions of the people that you're trying to advocate to talk to. And recent project I've been working on at Hounslow, and people say, oh no, don't talk to them, oh no, we know what they're gonna say, and they're just really negative and everything, and just try and get out there, and also I think sort of going alongside that to find the sweet spot, being able to respect professional service where maybe those people have gone through lots and lots of training to be able to do their job, but to be able to show them that, you know, sort of we have a level of, you know, sort of expertise around, you know, the discovery, around visualization, everything, and we can bring that and add value, but we're not trying to say, oh, and you're wrong, and just forget all the things, you know, that you've done before. It's really, really important to sort of give dignity to people and respect them and take them along on the journey with you, rather than just disrespecting, you know, sort of their expertise and their experience and everything, because that's not how you sort of like form teams to go forward in a positive way. So that was it from us. Thank you.
Fantastic, Mia. Thank you so much. Next on the group, we have got Hedy. Are you there?
Yes. Hi. Yeah, we discussed all the different methods. We all thought they're all very useful and we use them all. We did discuss a bit around saying what Andrew said around the problem framing, that often people, you know, it's really important to spend a good amount of time there around the discovery. And that often people come more already with a solution to you and are wanting to go progressing towards that more sooner than really sticking with that problem. Well, that's really important. And then we also talked about the prototyping, about the issues and the challenges that people often expect it to be digital prototyping, even though we can also do it on paper and etc. And also that it is different way of thinking is sometimes difficult to do, that we focus more on outcomes instead of outputs. And that is a kind of a change in thinking for decision makers, for example, but it's sometimes difficult to establish that.
Yeah, I've been there. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm finding all these themes already just between these three. I've seen the 5-minute reminder though, so I'm going to be fast. Eleanor, I think you're next.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So in my group, there were 2 of us that work at DWP, one a designer, one a policy person. So that was quite interesting. Definitely felt like the methods were really useful. Ben's applying some of them in his work, doing some sort of health transformation work with policy teams to look at how he can sort of help those policy teams use design methods to do more problem definition and hypothesis design. And I'm in policy about to start a project where we're collaborating with design colleagues to specifically test these new ways of working. So that's quite exciting. So this seminar felt really timely for me. Challenge-wise, though, I think one of the big things is around sort of just having the support to work in a different way. The project I'm about to work on, we've got the kind of the senior support, we've got the resources allocated to it, so we're quite lucky. But it's about how can we do things differently and bring those design principles in when we're kind of under pressure from a minister to come up with a policy idea in sort of 24 hours. And that's where that thing that, you know, you were talking about earlier about how to kind of demonstrate the value of these tools quickly comes in, is really important, but really, really difficult. So yeah, really useful conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. We haven't had a 5th volunteer unless someone wants to really quickly shout, otherwise I'll tell you about my group. I don't need a book, I've got one. Chrissy and Tom were with me, and we talked about actually the theme of our chat more came up around like communication. So like Chrissy being in a kind of program manager role, Tom being like in that design role, like it was a big thing. So communicating these ideas to stakeholders and becoming influencers. So Tom talked us through using the business model canvas, and he actually used it, like transformed it to be more applicable to policy. I thought that was really interesting, but yeah, like sounds like communication and like influencing upwards and things is come out in all the groups. But fantastic. We'll leave it there for sharing back. I've put in the chat my email address, so if you did share back and you want a book, let me know. But I'll hand back to our hosts to end the day.
Yeah, thank you, Martin.
Oh, sorry.
Over to you, Katerina.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for a great presentation and a great discussion. It definitely feels like yeah, breakout rooms were full of interesting ideas. Thank you to everyone that attended today.